Moses stood on a mountain in Moab, staring out over a river he would never cross, and he knew this was his last speech. 40 years of wandering ended here, on the edge of a land he would never enter. Behind him lay Egypt, the desert, and every failure his generation had made along the way. In a few days he would die, and Israel would cross the Jordan without him. So he gathered the entire nation and told them exactly what would happen next. Not a vague promise, not a general warning. He gave them a list, and that list has shaped how people understand blessing and curse for over 3,000 years. It is called Deuteronomy 28, and once you understand it, you understand a pattern that runs through the whole Bible. Kings quoted it. Prophets repeated it. Entire nations rose and fell inside its logic. What did Moses actually say to them? And why does it still shape your life today, whether you know it or not? By the end of this video, you will know exactly what Deuteronomy 28 promises. You will see the blessings, the curses, and the one condition that decides which one you get. You will also see how this same pattern shows up again and again in the Psalms, in the prophets, and in the words of Jesus. You will even see it play out in real historical events, not just in ancient poetry. This is not a random list from an ancient book, it is a blueprint. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Stick around, because the last section connects this ancient chapter directly to a promise Jesus made hundreds of years later. Let's start with the setting, because the setting changes everything. Israel stood between two mountains, Gerizim and Ebal, right before entering the promised land. 6 tribes stood on one mountain, half the nation shoulder to shoulder, and 6 tribes stood on the other, facing them across the valley. One mountain would echo with blessing, the other would echo with curse. This was not a suggestion. It was a public, national ceremony, performed out loud in front of everyone. Moses was not writing a private diary entry. He was setting terms that the entire nation heard with their own ears. Every person in that valley knew exactly what was at stake. That is the first thing most people miss about this chapter. It was not abstract theology. It was a contract, read aloud with witnesses. And in the ancient world, a contract like this was not just religious language. It followed the same format kings used when they signed treaties with other nations, complete with blessings for loyalty and curses for betrayal. Israel was not just hearing a sermon, they were signing a treaty with God as the other party. Now let's look at the blessings themselves, line by line, because they are far more specific and far more practical than most people assume. Verse 3 says, "You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the field." That covers your work, wherever you do it. Verse 4 promises blessing on your children, your crops, and your livestock. Verse 5 blesses your basket and your kneading bowl, meaning your food supply stays full. Verse 7 promises something remarkable, something that sounds almost impossible for a small nation surrounded by larger empires. It says your enemies will attack you one way and flee from you 7 ways, retreating in every direction at once. Think about that image for a second. One threat comes at you, and it scatters into nothing. Verse 12 promises rain in its season, so your land produces instead of cracking under drought. Verse 13 says, "You will be the head, and not the tail, above only and not beneath, leading instead of being dragged along by circumstances you cannot control." That is not just prosperity. That is influence, reputation, and position among nations. Verse 1 adds one more promise that ties everything together. It says, "God will set you high above all nations on earth." Every blessing on this list is concrete. Nothing here is vague or symbolic. It is calendars, crops, children, and control over your own circumstances. Notice something else too. None of these blessings skip straight to comfort without effort. They describe a life that still involves work, still involves planting and harvesting, but where that work actually pays off instead of failing for no clear reason. Here is where the pattern interrupts itself, because right after all 14 verses of blessing, the tone changes completely and without warning. The text does not ease into the curses, it slams into them. And the curses mirror the blessings almost line for line, which is the part most readers never notice. You are cursed in the city and cursed in the field. Your basket and kneading bowl are cursed too, so your supply runs dry. Your children, your crops, your livestock, all listed again, but now under judgment instead of favor. Verse 22 lists sickness, fever, and inflammation that will not let go, along with drought and blight that ruin every crop before harvest. Verse 23 says the sky above you turns to bronze, and the ground beneath you turns to iron. That is a picture of total drought, heaven and earth both shut against you. Verse 25 reverses the enemy promise. Now you flee 7 ways instead of your enemies fleeing from you. Verse 28 adds madness, blindness, and confusion of heart, the kind that leaves a person unable to trust their own judgment. Verse 43 says, the foreigner among you rises higher and higher, while you sink lower and lower. By verse 48, the language turns brutal and specific. It describes siege warfare, starvation inside city walls, and exile among nations you have never even heard of, scattered so far from home that your own children forget the language you speak now. This is not poetic exaggeration. It reads like a historical record written in advance, describing events that had not happened yet to a nation that was still 40 years from settling down. And here is the part that turns this from theology into documented history. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to Assyria, and its people were deported and scattered exactly the way verse 64 describes. In 586 BC, Babylon crushed Jerusalem, burned the temple, and marched the survivors east in chains, fulfilling the siege language of verse 52 almost word for word. Centuries later, in 70 AD, Rome destroyed Jerusalem again and scattered the Jewish people across the known world, an exile that lasted nearly 2,000 years. Historians do not need to believe in prophecy to confirm these events happened. They are recorded in Assyrian records, Babylonian chronicles, and Roman histories, completely outside the Bible itself. That is exactly what makes Deuteronomy 28 different from a simple moral lesson tucked away in an old religious text. It reads like a warning label written centuries before the product failure it describes. So here is the real question. Why would God lay out a curse this detailed before anyone had even broken a single rule? The answer is the one condition that controls everything in this chapter, quietly deciding which outcome plays out, and it sits right at the start of both lists. Verse 1 says, if you fully obey the Lord your God. Verse 15 says, but if you do not obey the Lord your God. That single word if is the hinge the entire chapter swings on. This was never about random luck, mood swings, or an angry God rolling dice somewhere out of sight. It was cause and effect, written into a covenant that both sides agreed to out loud in front of witnesses on 2 separate mountains. Obedience was not the reward. Obedience was the trigger. The blessing and the curse were both already loaded. The only question was which lever the nation would pull. That is why the same chapter can hold both outcomes without contradiction. It is not fate, it is a formula. Once you see the formula clearly, you start noticing it everywhere else in Scripture, in places you probably read 100 times without spotting the connection, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Psalm 1 describes a person who avoids wicked counsel, refuses to stand with mockers, and delights in God's instruction instead. That person is compared to a tree planted by streams of water, bearing fruit in season, its leaves never withering even in drought. Same structure. Obedience produces stability and fruit. Malachi chapter 3 uses almost identical language centuries later. Long after the exile Moses warned about had already happened once. It tells the people to bring their full offering, and promises blessing poured out until there is no more room left to store it. Same pattern again. Condition first, outcome second. Even Jesus builds his teaching on this same skeleton. In Matthew 7, he describes 2 builders working on the same stretch of coastline. One digs deep and builds on rock. The other takes the shortcut and builds on sand. The storm hits both houses equally, with the same wind and the same rain. Only the foundation underneath decides which one survives and which one collapses. Deuteronomy 28 is not an isolated chapter sitting alone in the Old Testament. It is the original template that the rest of the Bible keeps reusing in new settings. Here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. The part most people never connect back to their own lives. This chapter is not really about ancient Israel's farming season or its weather patterns 3,000 years ago. It is about a principle bigger than any one nation or any one century. Obedience lines your life up with how things actually work underneath the surface, and that alignment produces stability you can build on. Disobedience misaligns you from that same reality, and misalignment eventually produces breakdown. Whether that breakdown shows up in your health, your relationships, your finances, or simply your peace of mind. The ancient audience heard this in terms of rain and crops, because that was their daily reality. You might hear the same principle in terms of decisions, habits, and consequences that show up months or years later. The language changes. The mechanism does not. That is also why the curses are described in such extreme detail, more than twice as long as the blessing section. Moses was not trying to scare people for entertainment or to keep them anxious. He was making absolutely sure no one could later stand up and claim they misunderstood the terms. A short warning gets ignored. A detailed one gets remembered. If you have ever noticed that warnings in your own life tend to be longer and more specific than praise, this is the same instinct at work. Detail is what makes a warning survive being ignored the first, second, and even the 10th time. So, what does this mean for you right now? Reading this instead of Moses' original audience 3,000 years ago? It means blessing and curse were never about luck, mood, or random chance handed out at God's whim. They were about alignment, plain and simple, the same way a car runs smoothly when every part is lined up correctly. Choices trigger consequences, and those consequences compound over time, the same way interest compounds quietly in a bank account, except this account runs on obedience and character instead of money. Deuteronomy 28 gives you the clearest, most literal, most complete breakdown of that principle found anywhere in Scripture. Read it once, and you will start recognizing its shape in nearly every other blessing and curse the Bible ever mentions. If this changed how you see the rest of the Bible, do one simple thing before you close this app tonight. Open Deuteronomy 28 for yourself. Read both lists side by side from start to finish, and notice how closely they mirror each other, line for line. Then come back and tell me which single verse hit you the hardest.